In this kind of light, of course, the facade of the mountain looks flat. But in the morning, this is La Cueva Canyon going up right in front of us here. And the shadows are thrown across and they graze the shield and the pyramid. And then at night, they come in the other way and you get a sense of depth. Also, when the storms come in, all of that peak will fall back into the snow and the clouds, and it seems many miles deep, whereas now, in the flat light, it looks as if it stands straight up. In the first place, it wasn't what I thought, it was what my dad thought I should do. To answer that part of the question, I'd say, yes, I probably would have become a painter sooner. But you've got to realize that he came out of a milieu with Will Rogers and that bunch in Oklahoma. And Will Rogers' famous statement was, when a man ain't nothing else, then he is a artist. It's the only thing a man can claim to be, and nobody can show he ain't. So that was about what being an artist was in my family. And I had a cousin tried, and he was the black sheep. So yes, there was a very definite effort put out. He was in the house several times, and I remember the day he got killed with Wiley Post, the shock of everybody. I think I was 10 years old, but I never sat down and talked with him and got to be a friend of his. I was making a will for a doctor, friend of mine, who had been given about a year to live with cancer. And he was telling me what he was going to do. And I got Connie, the secretary, in and was dictating the will, and we took a break to smoke a cigarette. In any event, I asked Connie what she'd do, and she said that she'd travel. And she said, what would you do? And I said, I'd get in a room with some paint and some canvas and try to paint one good painting. And I got home that night and said, what in the world am I doing with my life? I'm only issued one. And if I really feel that way, and this isn't a lot of bull, I'm wasting it. And the most tragic thing any one of us can do is when we go to check out, say, hold it, I haven't done my best. Now that's a tragic life. Now if you've done your best whenever you check out, you're fulfilled. But you have to start looking at your life sooner or later from that viewpoint. And it took me quite a while. I was in my 30s before I finally reasoned it through. Well, the time back in the service was involuntary. I was dancing to the tune. When I started painting, I wasn't good enough to sell. And for 4 or 5 years, I couldn't possibly have lived off of my product. So I was flying for the New Mexico Air National Guard. And it was a neat deal. You flew Thursday and Friday nights, Saturday mornings, and 1 weekend a month. And that was perfect for a painter. And so I had been making enough money by staying current in their equipment to be able to shelter myself and to continue my progress as a painter. And so you really couldn't feel any chagrin or anger or anything else. After all, I had taken the benefits and I owed them this obligation. So that's how that happened. I would prefer Bierstadt for his composition. Moran is still far my superior in his ability to render texture, foreground detail. The guy was masterful, but putting together the total painting for impact, Bierstadt. But of course, my heroes were George Inness and Frederick Church, I would say, and for composition, Hopper, who painted more urban scenes than what we would call natural landscape. But all of these people were individuals and painted their own paintings. And one of the things that we are as painters, if we're going to succeed, is we're individuals. And so to attempt to paint like Bierstadt, I can't. The first landscape paintings, of course, were incidental behind the figure. And we get them in the Italian school. And I'd say Van Ruysdael, the Dutchman, was the first. He and Meinert Habema were the first great landscape painters. And they would paint the world. I remember there's a painting of a cloud by Van Ruysdael called Egmont am See, that you can reach behind that cloud. It's floating, it has body, and it has light in the air. And he was a magnificent painter. So these things, I don't know what makes a man a landscape painter except choice. And when you make the choice, you have made a choice that you will never be popular with everyone who's interested in art, because most people are interested in the human side of life. And this is an impersonal, natural side that doesn't carry as much interest. So you will probably attract 1 in 20, 1 in 50 of the people who are interested in paintings. So I'd say that if you only appeal to 1% of those people who were interested in paintings or music or writing, but if you really did your job well, that you would be well occupied, that your product wouldn't be enough. There isn't that much good product. When I'm hot and on a roll, it will go 7 hours, 8 hours, 7 days a week. That's 56 hours a week, probably actually at the canvas, and another 4 or 5 hours a day thinking, because it's an intellectual thing, not a physical one. And you take a big painting, like the big Grand Canyon that was down at the museum and is now over at the Gilcrease. That's 6 by 10 feet. I went straight on that about 9 weeks. You catch fire. You got lightning in your hand. When you're turned on, you can paint. When you have it in your heart, when you have it in your mind, when everything comes together and you're tearing at it, you'll do a good painting. I don't know what it's called, but I'll tell you, if you want to paint a lousy painting, go in there because you have to, and go to the easel and paint something you're not interested in very much. Oh, it's pleasure. It's a physical thing in that you feel joy, you feel excitement. It overwhelms you. You have it when you do a good job. A guy can't have it all the time. So I'll go sometimes 10 days. If I get stuffed up and think I'm going flat in my work, we'll get in the car and we'll go out and we'll paint in the open. And it has to happen voluntarily. You can't force it. But sooner or later, it'll come back. And lots of times, you'll be going to paint the Grand Canyon, and you'll get no further than Gallup. You know, the sun will hit the red cliffs, and lots of times, you have the painting in your mind, and then you go hunting for a little bit of reality to reinforce it. See, when I first started to paint, I painted entirely from imagination. That's the beauty of representational art, is that you don't have to measure reality and be restricted to it. You can paint representationally something that's in your mind. So your means of expression are just as good as any author's. No, I was prepared to make the effort, to make the commitment. And I made the commitment with an open mind. I decided to ask myself, as you paint, Do you enjoy it? Do you get a return? Is this what you like to do? And I found out I did, and that's what you have to have. And I see a lot of people who want to paint, and I say, when have you last painted? They don't paint. They do not like the physical act of getting their hands dirty. There are a lot of guys like to write, but they don't like the physical mechanics of getting the words down and correcting on paper. So that's one thing you have to have. And if you have that, and if you're willing to work at it and willing to try to improve yourself, all of a sudden, what you end up with is something amazing, and it's called self-respect. And I've tried to get self-esteem from flying jet fighters. I've tried to get self-esteem from educating myself and practicing and trying cases. And I never got it. I always knew I was a phony. And you look at a good lawyer, and a good lawyer loves the law. He loves practicing it. And if I'd stayed in the law, I would have been a competent lawyer, I hope. But when they would send out the list, like was published the other day, of among the lawyers who are the best, I knew in my heart that although I practiced, I did not burn for this. This was a job, and this was something that I tried to do conscientiously. But it did not consume me like painting. I really love to paint. And I paint on Sundays. I paint on Saturdays, because there is nothing that I would like better to do than to paint. It's not an obsession, it's a joy. The first thing, I don't know if you like Pablo Picasso, and regardless of whether you like what he did, I think that you'd have to admit that he's the most successful painter in our century.
Yes.
And when Pablo was an old man, he came out with that beautiful truth that people in their 90s have. I was listening to Rubinstein the other day. He was being interviewed, and he spoke from the heart the same way. They have nothing to prove. They tell you the cold, beautiful truth of a whole lifetime. And they asked him whether he thought he was a great painter, and he said, no, I am an entertainer who understood his times. And I thought that's the greatness of the man. He understands his business. And if what you paint is what everybody else paints, if you think that you're going to be able to please people by painting a head of a cowboy or an Indian, which has been famous recently, and because you have polished your skills, you can paint a better head than Joe Blow. That's an awfully tight little corner you're painting yourself into, and there's very little emotional effect you can have on the public. But if you can look at what excites you and turns you on and gives you this tremendous enthusiasm and pleasure, and then communicate it, you're going to stop somebody somewhere, and he's going to look at that, and you're going to communicate with him, and you'll change his life, of course. Representational art especially, and to a great extent op art, are a series or a compounding of scientific inventions. And in the Renaissance, 3 inventions came together. That of geometry, of what we call linear perspective, that of modeling with different brightnesses of light. We call it chiaro oscuro, bright shadow, which was a scientific way of rendering a round head with a highlight, middle tone, shadow, backlight. And very scientifically, they invented how to make a person appear in the half light, such as you do right now. The Chinese didn't have it. The Persians didn't paint that way. No other culture had invented it. It was invented in Western Europe. So we had perspective, chiaro oscuro, And then the next invention was the putting of atmosphere into the painting. Leonardo da Vinci came up with that. And so we had a sense of depth through atmosphere. And then along about the 17th century, we learned that a rounded surface, we would make a soft or blurred edge, and a sharp surface, we would do it with a very sharp edge. And we learned how to model our edges. Rembrandt was excellent at that. And so we came on up into the 18th and 19th centuries with these several inventions all coming together to compound themselves into how we see things. And the camera of the 19th century was the Industrial Revolution's interpretation of this. Of course, by then we had had Sir Isaac Newton, who discovered that white light is a series of all the different rainbow colors. But that wasn't incorporated into art until the Impressionists 100 years later. I think that the artist who says, well, science is heartless and science is so multifarious that it has nothing to do with art, it has no soul, really being lazy. You and I can be interested in science and be scientifically literate without it monopolizing our lives. It's amazing how few people are interested on whether or not they're going to take lasers and be able to have controlled thermonuclear power. I think they're going to run a test up at Los Alamos this month or next month. Well, I'm quite as interested in that as to who wins the World Series. There's nothing esoteric about it. We're standing right on the brink of a new age for humanity. For 1 million years, you and I have lived in the age of fire, in the age of chemical reactions. And we're right now on the threshold of the age of limitless energy. It's going to change everything. It's even going to change how we look. Our body hair. Why do you suppose we have the hair patterns we do? It's because we've had fire for 1 million years. We've worn clothing. In other words, our inventions change us. And we're right on the edge of another one. And I think that that's exciting. And I think that a person who's communicating with other people ought to live in the age with his age and communicate it. And that's the reason I have not much urge to paint historical subjects. And it requires a different skill. And painting a human subject is very difficult. You've seen a few portraits that I've done here in the house. I'm not a good portraitist. I don't know if I ever could be. But I know a lot of portraitists who cannot paint landscape. And I think that we have to follow our own interests. But I think that the critics, most of them don't paint.